So your other option, other than writing one sonnet and one poem modeled on Heaney's dream, so the sonnet would be 14 lines and the other poem is required to be 15 to 20 lines, would be to write a single sestina. So that is 39 lines by itself, but you'd only write one. Your goals, if you're trying to write a sestina, as with the sonnet, have to do with following an exact structure that is specific to the form. So, a sestina. 39 lines, each of which is 10 syllables long. No rhyme scheme. And yet, the end word of every line in a sestina is predetermined by the first stanza. They follow exactly the same pattern of the example I'm about to show you, which is in your packet, and the other example in your packet. This one is called Sestina. The other one is called Grandmother Grace. And they both follow this pattern. You might see it as the easy thing about the sestina or the difficult thing about the sestina to realize that the 6 words that end the lines tell you how the poem is going to go. House, grandmother, child, stove, almanac, tears. I have color-coded those. I have given them names, A through F. A sestina is required to have the lines end in this exact order: A, B, C, D, E, F, F, A, E, B, D, C, C, F, D, A, B, E, E, C, B, F, A, D, D, E, A, C, F, B, B, D, F, E, C, A, and then in the last 3 lines, after you've used all 6 words 6 times each, that's 36 lines in 6 6-line stanzas, you have to use all 6 words in just 3 lines. Basically, in a sestina, you're allowed to do that however you want. This particular poem puts F and E together, B and D together, and C and A together. And that particular ordering, if you look through the poem, it's like, well, where did that come from? There isn't a set standardized rule for those last 3 lines. But the first 36 are exactly set. The sestina is a form, the easy part of which is once you know the ends of the 6 lines, you know the end of every line in the first 36. You just plug them in. The challenge, as with the sonnet, make all the lines 10 syllables long, and yet still make the poem make some kind of sense. Somehow or other, you have to use those 6 words all of those times over and over again and make it make sense. If you take a pencil and you go through Grandmother Grace and you label those end words, you'll get the exact same pattern there that you get here. The first stanza of Grandmother Grace is A, B, C, D, E, F. The next is F, A, E, B, D, C. The next is C, F, D, A, B, E. I will not go on, you get the idea. So listen to a sestina that actually has sentences that manage to stay in the same rough rhythm, about 10 syllables every line, and still say something. September rain falls on the house. In the failing light, the old grandmother sits in the kitchen with the child, beside the little marble stove, reading the jokes from the almanac, laughing and talking to hide her tears. She thinks that her equinoctial tears and the rain that beats on the roof of the house were both foretold by the almanac, but only known to grandmother. The iron kettle sings on the stove. She cuts some bread and says to the child, "It's time for tea now." But the child is watching the tea kettle's small hard tears dance like mad on the hot black stove, the way the rain must dance on the house. Tidying up, the old grandmother hangs up the clever almanac on its string. Bird-like, the almanac hovers half open above the child, hovers above the old grandmother and her teacup full of dark brown tears. She shivers and says she thinks the house feels chilly, and puts more wood in the stove. "It was to be," says the marble stove. "I know what I know," says the almanac. With crayons, the child draws a rigid house and a winding pathway. Then the child puts in a man with buttons like tears and shows it proudly to the grandmother. But secretly, while the grandmother busies herself about the stove, the little moons fall down like tears from between the pages of the almanac into the flower bed the child has carefully placed in front of the house. "Time to plant tears," says the almanac. The grandmother sings to the marvelous stove, and the child draws another inscrutable house. Now, yes, this poem to some extent requires you to know the words equinoctial and inscrutable, but really, the basic idea of the poem is that you have a grandmother and a granddaughter sitting in a kitchen near a wood stove, making some tea, making some drawings, and thinking about the weather forecast and the almanac. And the grandmother is, for some reason, trying to hide her emotions. She's feeling something that's causing her to try to hide her tears. The first stanza tells this, laughing and talking to hide her tears. Whether the granddaughter knows or understands, we don't know. We know that the child watches the tea kettle. We know that the child makes a drawing and shows it proudly to her grandmother while the grandmother talks about the weather. And frankly, that's all we need to know to understand that the situation here is one person, the older, trying to hide from the younger some things that maybe a kid doesn't have to know about. And yet, the writer, Elizabeth Bishop, does all of this, repeating those 6 words. Every single one of those 6 words is used at least 7 times as the end of 6 different lines, and then one more time in the last 3 lines. The sonnet, the great challenge, is you have to rhyme, and you have to still try to make sense while rhyming. The Sestina, you don't have to rhyme. You just have to really stick with those words and still try to make sense while maintaining roughly 10 syllables per line. I say roughly. We'll talk later about the beats in a line, the rhythm. 10-syllable lines really here mean 5 beats per line, but you don't need to worry about that yet. That's later when I'll start to show you with your own poems how the rhythms work. All you really need to know is that a 10-syllable line tends to have somewhere between 4 and 6 stresses, usually about 5. Sometimes you only need 9 syllables, sometimes you need 11. If you look at this particular poem, you'll find that almost every line has 10 syllables, but some of them have 9, 11, even 12 occasionally, not very often. So your job if you write a sestina, which is a very mathematical form, is to follow the repetition of the words, try to get the right number of syllables, and still have the poem make some kind of sense. Best of luck.